And we're on the air. Hello, friends. Welcome to Codementor Office Hours for today. My name is Mark. If this is your first time joining us, basically what we do is we get together online with some of our favorite tech experts and try to do a really deep dive on a subject that's maybe not getting a lot of coverage in sort of the tech education world, or just something that's really challenging our community and really try to wrap our heads around it. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be sort of talking about a general topic, but if you have any questions and you're in the room with us, feel free to throw them into the group chat window. If you're watching this from the live broadcast on the Google Plus page, which I see there are quite a few people there, there should be a little blue Q&A button. Sometimes it's hard to see, but it's in the corner, and I'll get notifications about those questions, and we'll try to hit as many as we can. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's guest. Today we have Andrew Connell, who is an entrepreneur and developer with an emphasis in Microsoft SharePoint and content management systems. Back in April of 2005, he was recognized by Microsoft for his community contributions by being awarded Most Valuable Professional for Microsoft Content Management Server, and has received the award annually for SharePoint every single year since. Most of his work these days involves working with SharePoint, Office 365, as well as different web development technologies. So he's joining us today. We'll be walking through building SPAs with Angular for Office 365, SharePoint, and just sort of talking about what's the latest with some of these new Microsoft tools. So please welcome Andrew.
Hey, thanks, Mark. How are you today? I appreciate. Yes, I appreciate you having me on here. I guess so. I guess a little bit more about my background, real briefly, aside from what you just said, is that I've been really deep in the SharePoint and 365 space for the last, for SharePoint for the last decade, but for Office 365, as Microsoft has started to push more of their products to more subscription-based, and in Office 365 being specifically around SharePoint hosting SharePoint for customers. This has been a much bigger an important thing for a lot of existing Microsoft customers, because we've seen moving from having a product that we host locally to one that Microsoft hosts. And then the thing that kind of brings with it is that traditionally, as like SharePoint developers that have been out there, we've been building solutions that run inside of SharePoint, so server-side code or fully trusted code. And the new approach is that now Microsoft is kind of following the rest of what we see a shift more in the industry, is that instead of running custom apps inside of existing platforms, we kind of run them on our own, and we talk to those other platforms with a client over HTTP model. So authenticating using OAuth and then using RESTful services and such. This has been one of the big things, though, specifically around using Angular. Has been a really popular thing in the SharePoint and Office 365 space, primarily because it gets you off the server. And so there have been a lot of questions around that. A lot of people have been confused about what that means for them, and so that's kind of what we're doing today. I don't have a whole lot of code to show. Really, I don't have anything. It was mostly going to be more of a kind of a Q&A kind of a thing. But there's so just wanted to go through and answer any questions that we have.
Awesome. Yeah, so as I said, guys, feel free to start throwing your questions in. Maybe to kick things off, Andrew, you could talk a little bit about what are the projects you're currently working on? What are the tools you're using, and how did you arrive at those tools?
Sure. So, I guess traditionally it's been I've been your classic Microsoft developer. So using .NET, writing stuff in C#, building web apps using things like ASP.NET on server-side code and such, but not doing a whole lot of stuff client-side. These days, though, things have really changed. I mean, as most of the people in the industry, I would say, we've noticed over the last year or two, specifically since Microsoft got a new CEO, is that the company is much more open. They're not so much closed-minded and stuff. The mindset of it's either if you're a Microsoft customer, we consider you to use all of our stuff, and that's no longer true. I mean, it doesn't matter what IDE you use, doesn't matter what editor you use, what language you use, what technology, what platform. It really doesn't matter. So these days, where I've spent most of my time is either building full client-side applications using Angular, specifically Angular 1.x, or doing server-side stuff with a mix of either ASP.NET or using Node.js. I guess, but specifically, my background focuses mostly around with Office 365 and with around hosting things up in Azure. But the nice thing about the way that things are set now with 365 is it doesn't matter what technology you use. It doesn't matter what platform you use. It doesn't matter at all, specifically around Office 365. I will say one thing that is kind of interesting to developers, and the question usually comes up. People ask, why do we care about this? I worked with Microsoft to go. They were one of the main sponsors of the Angular conference in GConf back in March of 2015 in Salt Lake City, and I did some sessions with them and a presentation or two on their behalf there. And what was really interesting is we expected to just get attacked by a lot of the audience. People who are mostly Google and Angular and open source developers. I mean, it's Microsoft. I mean, traditionally they don't have a good rap here, so we expected to be attacked there. It was very impressive seeing how interested people were, and so using specifically, as we're talking about today, using Angular to build custom apps that will extend Office 365, or using Angular to build what are called Office add-ins for things like Outlook, Word, and Excel that run either on the web or on a Windows desktop or on a Mac desktop or on iPhone, Android, Windows Phone. It doesn't matter. I mean, you can use Angular to work with all of these things. So you see people are getting much more interested in it. That's where I've been spending most of my time in the last, I guess, year to two-ish, partly because it's something different for me. I mean, I'm a classic dev. I get tired of doing the same thing after a while. But the other side is, I mean, I really believe this story. I really believe the direction that we're going. Really believe in the direction that we're going here. So that's pretty cool.
Awesome. So we got a question in from Mark Walls, who I think is in the live broadcast. Are you concerned about Angular 2.0 and how it will change, says what you're showing us here, I guess referring to integrating it with Microsoft?
Yeah, so I guess, my take on where we are with Angular, and it really has nothing to do with Office 365 or SharePoint. This is just kind of, I guess, more big picture around Angular 2.0 is that a lot of the stuff that we've seen, a lot of the performance stuff that we've seen, a lot of the how things are being done, dependency injection, the speed at updating the UI and stuff. I mean, there's a lot of really cool things that they're doing in the integration with taking advantage of things like TypeScript. But to me, we're still way early on Angular 2. I mean, to me, it's not ready for prime time. I personally have not done anything with it aside from just the academic kind of consuming what other people are writing about it and saying about it, just because to me it's still a long ways off. One of the things that really does surprise me about it is the fact that from the limits, the minimum browser specs that we're seeing that Angular 2 is going to require, they're pretty steep. And with them being as steep as they are, I'm surprised that fewer people are not everyone's kind of chomping at the bit to get into Angular 2. But as a developer, hey, that's cool. But what really matters is the customers. And if they don't have the browser spec to get to that point, it's kind of a bit of a challenge. So specifically around Office 365, since that's the kind of the theme here, Office 365's minimum browser spec is, I think, at IE 8 or IE 9, something like that. So there are a lot of people that are out there that are not going to be able to, that are still probably or potentially going to be on IE 8, and we know that Angular 2 isn't going to support that. We know that Angular, I think 1.4 doesn't even support 1.8. So, to me, it's kind of like we're a long ways off for being able to take advantage of Angular 2 from a customer point of view. So as a developer, I look at it and say, hey, it's all cool and sexy, and there's a lot of cool stuff that we can do with it. But in the real world, I'm like, we're not going to be able to play with this for a while unless you're working within a very closed ecosystem or a very controlled company that says, they're not using Internet Explorer as a default browser, or they're saying they are using something like Firefox or Chrome. But most enterprises are not using a third-party browser, not third-party. Most enterprises are not using Chrome or Firefox as their primary browser for a very large cross section of their customer base. So I think we've got a lot of time there before that's really gonna kick in. I'd love to see it change quicker. I mean, there's a lot of really cool stuff that we can take advantage of with Angular 2. But right now I'm kind of looking and just saying, it's just the new router that we can take advantage of in 1.4 in our existing apps. We still got a ways to wait. So.
Yeah. Do you know anything about their new browser coming out, replacing IE?
So yeah, so the new one, I guess it was codenamed Spartan. I saw a comment just pop up a second ago. So it's codenamed Spartan, but they announced, I think it was maybe 3 weeks ago, at Microsoft's Build conference in San Francisco. I think it was late April. That it has an official name now. Is Edge is the name of that browser, or what the real production name will be. It's going to essentially replace IE, but not really replace IE in the sense that IE is still, the new browser, Spartan or Edge, is an evergreen browser, the same way that Firefox and Chrome are. And so that's going, in the long run, that's going to really get us around the issues that we have today. That's just kind of going through, which is not everyone's going to be up to date on the latest browser. They're going to be on an evergreen browser. Well, there are still a lot of organizations that are still going to be on IE 9, 10, 11, and they're not going to be able to switch over right away. Also, I personally haven't seen anything about the new Edge browser is going to be available anywhere other than Windows 10. So that's also going to kind of hamper, or not hamper, but that's also going to say that there's only specific places that we're going to where we're going to see that we can actually take advantage of that thing. So, I mean, yeah, in the long run, it's a very good move by Microsoft. It's good that we're going in that direction. But realistically, I'm very pragmatic when it comes to this stuff. Realistically, it's not going to change my life right away. It's not going to change my life in the next 12 months, and it may not even change it for the next 24 months. So it will help. Definitely will help. Cool. I saw the comment one person put up there, and it said, "Kill everything from IE 9 and below." I'm like, hey, I'm right there with you, man. I mean, I'd love to kill every browser that's out there except for the evergreen browsers. But I mean, in the real world, well, nobody gave me the keys to the internet yet, so I can't really do that.
We gotta get on that. I see we have a bunch of people who actually just joined. So if you're just joining, we're talking to Andrew, who is an expert Microsoft developer. And this is really a session pretty much all answering your questions. So go ahead and send your questions in through the Q&A app or the group chat, whatever's convenient for you. Rob Windsor from the live broadcast. Are you limited in what you can do if you have a completely on-premises environment?
That's a good question. So I'm familiar with that name. Rob's a friend of mine. And so what Rob is saying, for everybody who's not familiar with SharePoint or Office 365, we have traditionally come from a world where you bought SharePoint, which is an enterprise collaboration portal tool. It's kind of Microsoft's place to also do business intelligence, content management, collaboration, etc. We traditionally purchased that product. We installed it on our own corporate servers, our own company servers, and then we hosted it ourselves. So you can think of it almost like an SAP or like a big ERP system like that, a big financials package. We now call that an on-premises installation, and now a hosted or a cloud installation is what Office 365 is. And when I started at the beginning of the talk here, I was saying a little bit that we are moving from Office 365, or from on-prem over to Office 365. We're moving to have this more kind of client over HTTP model and away from server-side code. What Rob's referring to is there's a lot of stuff that we could do over the last decade using fully trusted code that ran on the server. And where are we? What things are we losing? Are we limited in certain things that we can do with this new model, with working with things just in the browser compared to working with things code running on the server? Are we limited in any of those things? And the answer is, I mean, yes, we definitely are. And part of it is because of the way that the product was architected, and also the way that the extensibility model for SharePoint was set up for so long, was that they allowed us to hook into their stuff pretty deeply and to add our own custom code, how things are going to run, and how those things are going to run. But now, the more that we look at it, Microsoft is kind of getting in this mode of get out of SharePoint, get out of building stuff in our environment, and instead build it on your own environment and talk to us over web services or HTTP REST type calls, or another thing we have is something called the client object model, the CSOM, which is a proxy API to a backend REST API. Are there things that we can't do? Absolutely. There are, and there will be things that we can't do, and it's because a lot of those things we look at now, or Microsoft looks at now and says, you really shouldn't have been doing them in the first place. Like, we had a thing called a timer job, which you could write like a scheduled process that would run in the context of SharePoint at certain intervals. We can't do that using this new model because we can't put our code deep into SharePoint. Instead, we're running outside of it. However, there's ways to accomplish similar things, like building a process that lives out inside, say, Heroku or AWS or Azure, and then have some sort of a cron job that hits that at certain intervals, and then that thing would go into your hosted environment, authenticate using OAuth, and then use the RESTful APIs or the CSOM to actually get data out or to interact with SharePoint in that way. So are we losing some things? Yes. Are some of those things do they apply, or should we doing them? That's debatable right there. Microsoft says a lot of things no, we should not be doing, and you won't be able to do. But are there ways around a lot of those limitations? Yes. But cards on the table. Are there some things that we just simply will not be able to do in this new model? Absolutely. One of the nice things that we have seen is that in the last, this year, I think it was in February, is that we recently got support. So I guess let me back up 1 second. Is that I'm giving a long-winded response to Rob here, but this it's pretty applicable. Office 365 is the entire directory part of Office 365. So all authentication, both for users and for apps, is all backed by something called Azure AD. So you've probably heard of Active Directory. It's something on Windows. Azure AD is an Azure version of Active Directory, and it's not the exact same thing. You don't have like group policy and adding computers and stuff like that, but for the user piece, it's right there. I see Rob added a little bit of a follow-up there. I'll incorporate that. The thing that we can do about in terms of like authenticating and talking to these different applications, if you want to build like an Angular-based application, authentication was a challenge. But in March of this year, or February of this year, we got the ability for Azure to have support for what's called the OAuth implicit flow, which allows us to have a full client-side authentication piece to it. So you can have an application that is 100% client-side, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, zero server-side component, that can authenticate with Azure, obtain an access token, and then use that to talk to SharePoint. Now, the other piece is that's all about if we're talking about in Office 365. What about talking server-side stuff? If we're talking about, what if we're talking about things that are just on premises, and I want to build a single-page app that's going to run in a SharePoint on-premises environment? What the on-prem environment does not have is the true OAuth support authentication we have. It still essentially comes down to a claims-based model or a Windows authentication model, like NTLM. And for that, the way the authentication is still going to happen is that you either have to have your application be surfaced from SharePoint so that the application is going to assume the same identity of the page that you're currently logged into, or if your application lives outside of SharePoint, it's going to run, say, on your own web server somewhere within your organization, you're going to want to have some sort of a server-side intermediary that can do the authentication and hand off an access token to your single-page app, and then your single-page app can then use that to call the different RESTful APIs. Or you're going to have to have a RESTful API or some sort of a web API in your custom app that your single-page app is going to talk to as an intermediary to get to your on-prem SharePoint environment. So that's one of the kind of hitches that we have there. We see Microsoft is building things, and they're improving their hosted story first, and then some of those things are making them back to the on-premises product. But we're seeing much more innovation happen much quicker in the cloud because they own the entire environment, whereas the on-prem environment is only really going to be updated on this 2 or 3 year release cycle that we traditionally see with released Microsoft products.
Awesome, thank you.
Long-winded answer.
That was great. And guys, if any of you are stressing about taking notes, all this is being live recorded to the Codementor YouTube channel, so you can always come back and revisit. So got a couple good questions in the group chat. Cynthia mentioned, what do you think about Irelia JS framework? How's it compared to Angular 2?
So that's a really interesting one. That's actually one on my list that I want to dive into a lot more. Irelia is really interesting. It takes, from the code samples I've seen, see, this is a hard one to answer because Angular 2 is not finished, and a lot of the samples that we've seen are kind of like work in progress. And so I don't think it's too fair really to do an apples to apples comparison between the two. But what is really cool, what I personally love about this client-side development style, is that it really doesn't matter what framework you choose, because it really is only going to matter for your application, and so you just kind of look at the ecosystem around you and say which one's the best bet. To me, Angular is a great bet because the ecosystem is ridiculously big and growing. But Irelia is backed by someone who's got a very good reputation in Rob Eisenberg, and it's also got a really good following so far. And what I've seen is that it's very elegant, and a lot of the code samples I've seen are much easier to consume than what I've seen to do the exact same thing in Angular 2. I can't say that I've spent enough time with Irelia to really give it a fair shake. It's definitely something on my list. When I was at the build conference for Microsoft, there were some Irelia guys that were there, and they stopped by and were showing how to go through and get up to speed and comparing with Angular 2 and Irelia. And I actually had booth duty for one of the things I was answering some questions for one customer while they were working at the booth showing this stuff off. I was incredibly distracted trying to really focus on what they were doing instead of doing my job, but had to do the job first. So I guess to answer the person's question who asked that, I mean, what do I think about the difference? It's definitely something that I'm interested in watching and spending more time with. Aurelia's I started off with Durandal doing all the single page app stuff, which is what Irelia was what their predecessor essentially was. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes, but it's too early to tell. I'd just, like every good developer, I'd make sure you carve out some time and spend time with both of them and see which one works the best for you.
We're giving you a lot of speculation questions today, things that haven't come out. We have another, the next one too from P. Joshi. So with the new browser that I know we don't know about yet, do you know, is Microsoft planning to fork off of Google's new Blink rendering engine?
That I can't say. I have no idea. I mean, there is some, Microsoft's talked a lot about the new browser. Again, it's called Edge. It was previously codenamed Spartan or Project Spartan. If you go to, Microsoft has a site called Channel 9. So if you go to, I think it's channel9.msdn.com. If you go there, you look for the events, find an event called Build, and do a search inside of Build for any session that's got the word Spartan or Edge in it. They've got a bunch of sessions that they're actually about the Edge browser, so you can definitely learn a lot more about it. To be honest, the conference was just 3 weeks ago, and I'm still catching up. I did 3 conferences in a row, speaking at different conferences, and so I'm still catching up from the content that I missed. And so Edge is definitely one of the ones that I've missed. So I've got my iPad loaded up with videos and just waiting for the next plane ride.
Question from Ivan. Do you see Microsoft dropping support for CSOM and only working on Office 365 API?
So it's a great question. So for everybody who's not familiar with this, Microsoft has a raw REST API for SharePoint and for Office 365, which is, it's all formed based on the OData v4 spec. But then they also have something called the CSOM, or the client-side object model, and it's essentially an abstraction of the server-side object model, but instead of going straight to the bare metal, it actually goes through a REST-style service to interact with the data. So developers have a choice, client-side developers have a choice on when they're working on the client, either in the browser or on a remote machine, to either use the raw REST API or using the CSOM. This is a bit of a religious war that people go back and forth with. So to the question, do I see them giving up on the CSOM? I don't expect them to give up on it. I think what we're seeing today is that they're still committed to both, and I say that because CSOM came from SharePoint. The original REST API that we had with SharePoint, they both kind of came out at the same time. The CSOM was much more full-featured than REST was, and the last release of SharePoint 2013, REST caught up with it a good bit, but it's still a bit like, there still was a gap where CSOM was above REST. And then since then, we've seen a lot of APIs come out around Office 365 services, such as things in Exchange, like Contacts, Calendar, Mail, the video portal, their social story, which is Yammer, the Files API, which is back their version of like the different online storage. They call it OneDrive or OneDrive for Business, which is a compete to Dropbox or Google Drive. When you see them release these different things, you're seeing native SDKs being released, which I would still consider those as like CSOM type things because they're native wrappers to a REST API. But then they also have the native REST API that's released. I don't see them getting rid of either one of them. I don't see them favoring one over the other. To me, I think that the emphasis first goes in the REST API, and then they work for on the native APIs that wrap the REST API, because the native APIs are calling the REST APIs for you. And so developers are free to choose which one do you want. Me personally, I prefer the REST APIs every day over CSOM when there's not missing functionality that is only in CSOM and not in REST, just because I'm not tying into a specific implementation. I can get objects back and I can bind them to anything I want because it's just JSON objects coming back in a JSON format.
Cool. Rob just sent in a comment on that too. Microsoft has been evolving CSOM for SharePoint Online. There was an update in last month.
Yeah. And when we say CSOM, generally CSOM refers to just SharePoint. When I was talking about the native SDKs, that's specifically to Office 365. To everybody else, I mean, to me, I look at CSOM as it's a native SDK to SharePoint. SharePoint being one component of Office 365, the other ones being Exchange, Skype, and Yammer.
Cool. Actually, I have another on-prem question, which is interesting. It's also from Ivan. We're on premises and won't have app domains set up for a while. We do have the services working though, so we can register apps and grant them permissions. Can we start writing external applications using Angular or SPA, or is there more we need to set up?
So I was just taking a second to actually understand where this was going. So directly to answer your question, you can start today. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. You can write, going all the way back to SharePoint 2010, or even going back to SharePoint 2010 if you wanted to, you can use Angular and build single-page apps, or really anything. You can use Ember or Irelia with any of them, because really the only thing that you really need for those to work is just to host them in the browser, but to give them any business value, they're going to have to talk to some sort of a service. And we really had good service. We had good services or good endpoint, and even the previous version of SharePoint, SharePoint 2010. So with that being said, you don't need the whole app service or app stuff. You don't need any of that stuff stood up to be able to take advantage of and building single-page applications or external applications, as you put it. The trick where things kind of come into what the app model is going to give you, or what these app services are going to give you, is really I look at it as kind of like two things. One of them is it's going to give you the ability to have a specific kind of deployment model. So in the past, when you wanted to deploy something to SharePoint, we called these things sandbox solutions, but essentially it was a little package of files that were given to SharePoint that were saved in a virtualized file system in SharePoint, and when you made a request to that page, it would pull all those files out of a database and give them to the browser, or return them back to the requester to the browser. What the app service gives us is the ability to have a similar kind of a package, but the deployment was much easier. So you can think of it the exact same way as like on Windows or on OS X or on iOS or Windows Phone, whatever. Instead of the installs being like a package file or an MSI or an executable, now you just go to a store and say, I want that, and it just installs, or it doesn't install, and the only option is to retry. Upgrades, same thing. Uninstalls, same thing. So the apps are going to give you an easier deployment story. The other thing that the apps are going to give you is the ability to have your app act as having its own first-class identity. So you can have an app have permissions to do things. You can have a user have permissions to do things. You can make it so that the user and the app must have permissions to do something that the app is trying to do, or you can have the app just have permissions to do something that is, how do I say it, that is irrespective and doesn't matter if the user does or does not have rights. So it's like an app-only permission. those are the things that you're going to be missing without having apps fully set up and configured within your on-prem environment. But there's nothing stopping you from building applications today. It's just that if I was in that situation that you're in, you're going to be using only user-based permissions. So the user running the application, once they're logged in, they're the ones that are going to be accessing calling the different services under the context of that user. If you host it outside of SharePoint, you're going to have some authentication stuff that you're not going to have fun with, because you got to do NTLM, you got to figure out how to do that handshake, which is not fun to mimic that handshake. The browsers do it just fine, but the multiple round trips to get the authentication handshake for every single request is not fun. So if you can host the application inside of SharePoint using like a sandbox solution, you'll be in better shape for the time being until you get the app server set up.
Cool. Hopefully that was helpful. How best can you implement remote SharePoint event receivers without using a provider-hosted app? Is it even possible to implement a remote event receiver that's handled in an SPA? Do you know of any developments in this area? Yeah.
So, I don't. So first, this really doesn't have anything to do with Angular or single-page apps, because what a remote event receiver is that we have these things in SharePoint called event receivers. You can think of, in SharePoint, we have our data structure in SharePoint is is a list, but it's very similar to a table. Columns, rows, very similar to a database table that we're all familiar with. An event receiver is essentially like a trigger on a table. A remote event receiver is saying that instead of that code being run inside SharePoint, instead SharePoint fires an event that calls an external web service and sends a payload and get a response back. It has nothing to do really with Angular or SPAs, because the service isn't. You don't have a service hosted by Angular or hosted by a SPA. That's a server-side thing. So I'm not really sure. Do we need apps for a remote event receiver? I don't. Or I guess provider-hosted app. That's essentially asking about if can we do apps, or do we need apps with this? I don't know. I don't know how to. I don't really know how I could say how. I don't think you can, but I don't know off the top of my head. That's a tough one.
No problem. Actually, so yeah, to try to bring it back more to Angular. We do a lot of sessions on Angular, on specific open source Angular tools people have built. You mentioned at the beginning, and obviously it's most closely associated to the open source world and like a lot of Google's tools. So what's the experience like for any developers that want to continue using it but moving towards using it with some of these newer Microsoft tools? What's that evolution like?
It's pretty good, I think. The one thing I like about, let's say if you're a traditional like Angular developer and you're interested in diving into these things, here I'll give you one example. So at the Angular conference, one of the things that we did is we held a hackathon one night, and in about 2.5 hours, there's an extensibility story that we have in the latest Office clients. So Office, Outlook, Word, Excel. What Microsoft did is that in the 2013 release and beyond, they have a new extensibility model where essentially you take a little XML manifest file that describes an application, so permissions, where does it run, what kind of an application is it, and you give it to the Office client. And there's different ways you can do that. You can get it from the store, like there's an Office store similar to how we have like the App Store. And when people acquire them or sideload it by just taking the XML and uploading it into Outlook, what that does is that installs the app. What that does then is depending if you're in Excel or Outlook or Word, how it's manifested is a little bit different, but you get this task pane off to the right-hand side, or in Outlook you actually get a little box that pops up between the header of the email and the body of the email. All that thing is just a little frame for a web application, and that web application can be an Angular app. So what we showed some people on how to do and how to show them, to getting back to your question on how easy it is to get up to speed, what we did at this hackathon is we took a bunch of Angular developers and we showed them how they could build an Angular app but how they could do it in the context of an Office add-in is what we call these extensions. How to build it as an Office add-in and have their add-in not only install and be registered within these different clients, but also how they communicate with the hosting Office application and how the Office application communicates back with their with the add-in that they've built. What was really surprising to me, and honestly the Microsoft guys that were there as well, is how much all the people, we had 12 or 13 teams, and how much all of those teams were able to accomplish in the span of 2.5 hours. We spent 25 or 30 minutes showing them how this stuff worked, and then over the next 2 hours, these guys just started hacking away, guys and gals just started hacking away one night, and were shocked at what they came out with in the next 2 hours. Really cool things with like D3 animations and charting. Some really good stuff about putting like tracking pixels in emails and checking to see if emails have been opened by people. But they took their Angular knowledge and they applied it straight to doing extensions and add-ins within Office, and were incredibly productive. Now, even outside of doing Office add-ins and doing add-ins for SharePoint, or even building external web applications or external spas that talk to Office 365, I think the latter two are even easier than building an Office add-in, because the only thing you have to figure out is how does the authentication work, and literally I can show that in like 10 minutes because of the work that the Azure team has done for us back in February. It's something called ADAL.js. So the Azure AD application library, and there's a JavaScript implementation of it that supports the OAuth implicit flow. It takes 10 minutes to show how that works, and then it's just calling services. And I don't think I'm painting with too broad of a brush, but every Angular developer is called a service. So it's really, really simple. I mean, just because the services are all OData services, they're self-documenting and they explain what they do. So it's super easy to get to the data. So I think that the story of coming from outside of Microsoft and actually coming in and taking advantage of something like Office 365 or SharePoint, using your Angular knowledge, is really good. And in fact, you could even make an argument that those people might even be at a slight advantage to the traditional SharePoint developer, because I was that guy too. We've had this mindset for a decade or more, trying to figure out how this kind of progression actually worked. It's funny, I'm sitting here looking at myself in the video and I'm realizing that I got a sunburn this past weekend on Memorial Day weekend, so I've got my little raccoon eyes going.
It's all good. You're in Florida, right?
I am. I'm in Florida, yeah. So
you have a good excuse.
Yeah, I enjoyed the beaches.
Cool. I got another question then, more on the Angular side as well. Can you recommend any UI frameworks for Angular aside from Bootstrap? I'm hoping to find controls that encapsulate some basic Angular functionality.
That's a great question. So you've got Bootstrap, obviously, we're all familiar with that one. There's other ones that if you want like the more packaged, everything's already done for you. Telerik's Kendo UI suite. I know there's other suites, like there's other paid suites like DevExpress and Infragistics and Component One, and all those guys, they all have fully client-side suites that you could take advantage of with Angular. One that I'm a big fan of actually is Material Design, the Google design language, and that's the one that I'm using inside of a lot of my Angular applications because it's really easy to work with. I like it more than Bootstrap. Nothing against Bootstrap, but kind of seen Bootstrap enough. You see enough sites that look just like the same. So I kind of like, and I like the way that Material Design has nice integration, or has a nice like package and integration with Angular. There was something that was kind of teased out at the Build conference, at Microsoft's Build conference a few weeks ago, that I'm really interested to see how this kind of how it evolves. And I'm not sure what name to actually use here, because I heard somebody use one name. I heard the presenter use one name, and then I've seen a couple other names kind of go around, and I'm not sure if it's called like the Fabric UI or the Fluent UI or what. But essentially, it's and this actually, I saw another question just came up by, I'm not sure if that's a name or a handle, but Oxteminfo, where a question was about how can I make my Angular spa look more like SharePoint for my end users? Is this common? Yeah, so this is where I'm going with this. He showed a design package at the very end of this one session, and I forget what the session code was, but it was a guy named Rolando that did a session on Office add-ins, and in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the session, he showed a preview of a design package language that is one that we're going to be able to use in our own single-page apps, our own web apps, that is the same UI components that Microsoft is using with Office 365 and with SharePoint. So the same toggle switches, the same drop-down, all that stuff. Again, I forget what the name is. I've been on their case about this for the last few months. About we need something to make it easier for us to build our apps that look like SharePoint, so that when my end user goes from a SharePoint experience that's out of the box or an Office 365 experience that's out of the box, and then they go to my application, they have to look at the URL to see, is this part of the app that I was just in, or is this just another place to go? I want my users to think it's just another place to go to get something else done. I don't want them to feel like, hey, we were just in Gmail and we jumped over to Salesforce. I mean, there's a clear UI difference between those two. I don't want my users to think that. I want them to think that they're in the same application. They've gotten end user training for working with lists and working with the UI in Office 365 and in SharePoint, both on-prem and in Office 365. And I want them to use that same design language. So aside from Bootstrap, aside from material design, that's another one that I don't know how far away we are with that. It was a little tease that we got from the whole thing. He showed a little bit of code in the video, and it looked like it was basically jQuery with a lot of jQuery extensions, which that's fine. But it'll be curious to see where they go with that. But just the fact that it was a custom app that was mirroring the SharePoint UI and the 365 UI, that's a good thing. So we'll see where that goes.
Awesome. Well, I don't want to take too much more of your time. You've been really generous. So if anyone else has any last few questions to get in, but one I always like to ask is, what other sources and references to continue learning about the stuff do you use, and recommend? Yeah,
sure. So if you're interested specifically in just the stuff I'm talking about, like Office and SharePoint development, the number one place to go is http://dev.office.com, just dev.office.com. That's like your portal for everything developer Office related, including SharePoint these days. There is also a GitHub repository where there's tons of projects that are referenced from dev.office.com. It's at github.com/officedev. And they also have a Twitter handle, the same thing, the Twitter handle is just officedev, @officedev. These guys, if you look at Microsoft today, and I would put a pretty good argument out there that Office 365 is the most open part of Microsoft now, in the sense that they've got native SDKs for iOS, Android, Cordova, Xamarin, .NET, you name it. So go to dev.office.com. There's a lot of good training samples out there, a lot of good code samples that are out there, a lot of stuff on GitHub. There's also a lot of good training videos and hands-on labs and slide decks and stuff that are out there. I'm working with them on a lot of that stuff as well, and we're pushing really hard, not just the Microsoft story, but then all they care about is you're using Office 365. They hope that you host the stuff in Azure, but if not, they don't care what else you're using. They just want you to use Office 365. Fastest growing product out there for developers. I'll give you a little secret here. Office 365 is the fastest growing product in the history of Microsoft. There are 470 petabytes of data in Office 365, and companies are flocking, and education space and governments are flocking to Office 365 and putting a ton of their stuff there. Who's got the money to go through and do custom dev? Enterprises. Guess where a lot of those enterprises are putting their data? Office 365. It's a good place to be. It's a good business to be in. Just don't share it with anybody. Just us. We'll keep that kind of secret there.
Sounds good. Cool. Where else can people follow what you're doing? Do you have a blog?
I do. It's just my name, just andrewconnell.com, 2 N's, 2 L's. I'm on Twitter, @AndrewConnell. You can find me on GitHub, /Andrew Connell. So it's pretty easy to find me. Yeah, I'm the Office 365 / full stack web developer, Andrew Connell. Not there's another 2 or 3 of us out there that's like the CTO of a 3D gaming company and a CTO of some other company. I got no executive stuff in me. I'm dev.
Just get those guys to use Office 365.
Oh, one of them is.
Nice. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for tuning in. Again, this is all going to be available for replay on the Codementor YouTube channel. I'll send an email out to everyone who RSVP'd with a link to some of Andrew's stuff and a link to the video. And please check out some more Codementor office hours and AMA sessions coming up. We have a lot of great stuff. And yeah, thank you guys so much wherever you are in the world. Good afternoon, morning, evening, and thanks for tuning in.
Thanks a lot.